better understanding land use processes and deforestation frontiers, you are in the right room. My name is Christian Levers. I am a senior scientist at the Thünen Institute of Biodiversity in Germany, and I'm really happy to co-chair the session today with also two speakers. Matthias Baumann, senior scientist at the Geography Department of Humboldt University Berlin, and Anna Buchadas, who was a PhD student at the same institute, same department, and is now a postdoc working with Eric Lambin at UC Louvain. We have basically two organizational things to start the session off with. It's a two-part session, the session now, and one after the coffee break, so please also join the second session. We have 6 presentations now, 5 full talks and a flash talk, and we have 4 full presentations in the session that is coming after this one. Secondly, to all the speakers, please stay within your allotted time, 12 minutes, 3 minutes discussion, so that we have the same and fair distribution of time throughout the session. I have nice cards here. I will indicate how much time you have left, and I will also cut you short if you extend too long. With that, I would like to hand over to Matthias, who will introduce the topic a little bit more in detail and will also give the first presentation of the session. Thanks a lot.
Okay, a warm welcome also from my side. Matthias Baumann from Humboldt University. And so I don't want to spend too many words on the introduction here. I'd rather go into the presentations quicker, but just to say that that we in our lab and with our collaborators, we have been thinking quite a lot on this topic for a bunch of years right now. And I think this research, the collaborations have yielded into this paper that came out this year that was looking more into a general overview, a review on explaining the emergence of land use frontiers. And what we want to do in this session, or what inspired us for this session, is to give some empirical examples of how this may look like in different contexts around the world. We have a full lineup, as Christian already said. We have now 5 full talks, 1 flash talk in the first session, and then 4 in the after session. And we are ranging from examples from Argentina, we are in Southeast Asia, we are we have some global work that we are presenting. So we have a good geographic coverage, with, for me as a geographer, is always something very nice. Okay, but let's start. It's me kicking off this work, and it's also it was the inspiration for bringing up this session here. It's a topic that we are working on quite a lot. It is a way or a proposal of finding new ways to use remote sensing derived data. We had an interesting discussion now that are exclusively land cover products or land cover time series into something more advanced that describes more land use processes, or the processes in this particular case of a global commodity frontier. I take an example here of the Gran Chaco that has one of the highest deforestation rates in the world. It is mostly for cattle. It is for cattle and for soybean, and the landscape looks in large areas like this. We have small remnants of forest left with large agriculture fields. In this case, it's a recently deforested area in between. And in our lab, we are interested in understanding these processes from the perspective of how these processes are ongoing, what are the outcomes in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon budgets, for example, or we are interested in how or which actors are involved in these areas. And when you start working on this and you're trying to disentangle these processes, you are facing 3 main knowledge gaps. And the first one is, where is this happening? So what are the spatial patterns of deforestation or of commodity frontier expansion? We look at the when, so the temporal dynamics of deforestation in a particular region, in this case, the Chaco. And what is probably from a land system perspective, the most interesting thing is the how. Like, how is this actually going? What are the underlying processes behind it? And so arguably we are, and Chris Justice said this also this morning in his keynote, I think we're in a very good position, and we maybe have never been better at understanding where and when forest loss happens. We can, using satellite data, we can go 40 years back nearly now, and understanding really good, has there been forest before, and now there's no forest anymore. But already here you can see quite a bunch of things. Yeah? You see forest loss, but you don't really know if you take a frontier, a commodity frontier perspective, you don't know if this is right away, is this a natural disturbance? So you see here burn scar to the left of the image, or is this for agriculture, or did deforestation happen here, which are more these weird patterns which are very common for the channel. You also don't really know when did this become actually a commodity frontier? When can we actually talk about a frontier? Did this happen very recently, or is this something that is already long time ongoing? And when you look at this image, you can also not really say, for what type of commodity is this frontier? Is this a primary frontier where at first the pasture expands into forests, or is this a secondary frontier where now croplands go over existing pastures before? And so the argument here is that, okay, we're getting better in understanding these general patterns of land cover, but we are still far away from understanding the processes when looking at when looking at remotely sensed land cover information. And so my key messages here are that I really think as a remote sensing community within the GLP, we need to find better ways of using remote sensing to go beyond describing just land cover change, or in this particular example from before, forest loss. And I'm proposing here what we would call frontier metrics that describe a little bit better how deforestation takes place. This is work we have published now a year and a half ago in environmental research letter, and back then already the first part was, of course, we need to consistently reconstruct the history of land cover in that region. And we did this for the Chaco. It was nearly 90,000 Landsat images, and we used those to broadly categorize on an annual basis into major land cover classes, woodlands, croplands, and pastures, most importantly. But then in the second step, we went on and took this land cover representation towards something that we would call frontier metrics. And to do this, we in the first step aggregated this categorical information into a more coarser resolution. And what you see now here is, you can imagine this as one pixel that we are looking at over time. Yeah? So we aggregate this, and then we could say from 1986 to 2020 or 2022, we have the time on the x-axis and the percentage woody cover on the y-axis. So we can map this, and then this may look like this. We have first very high fraction of body cover, and then we have a very strong dip in the middle of the time series, while at the end then it levels off again when little or almost no forest cover is left. Okay, what we did then is we took actually very established concepts from phenology modeling. In this case, it's a negative binomial, and we fitted this through this time series, and had then the advantage that when you have a function, a generic function, you can calculate things like a first or a second derivative, from which we then rule-based can extract more meaningful indicators of, well, is this actually frontier at first? Sorry, this comes a little early, but is this actually a frontier? How fast is this how fast is this frontier by looking at the steepest slope of the first derivative of this curve? And we can also say now more precisely when did this frontier actually start in this region. And so you can do this, I show this here for one pixel, but you can do this for every pixel in the landscape, and then you obviously can also create a map that is not a forest loss map or a cropland map, but it is actually a map that describes a process that has been ongoing in the landscape. And here we have, in this work, described 6 layers that show how deforestation is taking place. So now we're not talking anymore about forest loss, but we say something, is this an active frontier, or is this a frontier that is already suspended? has this frontier progressing very fast, like in Paraguay, or here in Western Argentina, or is this a frontier that progressed relatively slow here to the east of Argentina? And then we can do the same thing, saying something about, what is the frontier land use? So is this for pasture? Is this for cropland? Is this maybe first for pasture expansion and afterwards cropland expands over existing pastures? Is this a progressing frontier, or is this something like, we call it a leapfrogging frontier? That means it's an area that emerged in a large distance from existing frontier areas. And then as a last example, we can say how much natural vegetation, in this case maybe woodland, is left in this area. On the right side, you see basically a map on when these frontiers onset. And then we can take these and we can go take a map where we in previous work delineated frontier regions before, and we can now start saying something about this frontier region in terms of the processes or how the processes unfolded there. You can do this for every of the circles. I have done this here for two. One is in Central Chaco. It's in Paraguay. It's a frontier that was progressing continuously. It's stopped by now. It's identified through the icons. It is a slowly progressing, or was a slowly progressing frontier for cattle, and only little vegetation is left. Contrary, here in Tucumán, this is a frontier that is still active. It is slowly progressing, and it is a transition frontier, meaning, or secondary frontier, meaning that we had first an expansion of pasture lands, and now over these pastures, croplands are expanding again. And so through the conversion of land cover time series into something what we would call more a process-based variable, we are actually now able to provide or to get insights into frontier characteristics. Frontier characteristics that would allow us to maybe more precisely derive or define management options or intervention policies. Okay, so to take home, what I described here is a new way to describe how deforestation or commodity frontier expansion is happening. I show this for one of the most for one of the deforestation hotspots worldwide. It's in our opinion, in a way of converting of time series of land cover to say more about how deforestation is actually taking place, and hence a switch from land use change mapping into a mapping of a process in particular. This is robust and repeatable. We have updated these maps continuously. We're expanding it to the north, to the Chiquitania region in Bolivia, and it is without ancillary data, which is really important considering that we want to take these maps usually and bring them into other geographic analyses. Yeah, so we really still are interested only in using only satellite data. What we can do with this is now, okay, we have now different frontier types. This was the last map that I showed, and it gives us a better understanding of the mechanistic processes underlying frontier expansion in the Chaco, and it would also enable us to develop context-specific policy responses. With this, I would like you to thank you. Thank you with these two links here. You can check out our website from the Conservation Biogeography Lab. And also, I call this here more frontier stuff. We are doing a lot of things at the moment. We are developing an R package, so you don't have to download just for the Chaco the maps, but you can do this for your own study region. We are repeating this work at a global scale with WWF and trying to connect this to the Forest Fronts work. So it's a lot of things going on, and we encourage you to have a look at our website to see the processes. Feel free to contact us in any time you want if you want to know more. Thank you very much.
And thank you for staying perfectly in time. Are there any questions? You have been the first.
Thank you. It seems that everything you presented is related to the temporal domain, but I haven't seen anything about the spatial contents or how we can use another metrics that incorporate the sizes of patches or the spatial contents rather than temporal itself, because it might create a much better description of the processes. I don't know. I mean, I just want to know about it. Just suggesting.
Yeah, no, yes, and it's a good time for me to ask. So when you say spatial patterns, is you would create other variables, or you would see how these individual regions or pixels are located relative to each other? Okay. Maybe we should talk about So I think field sizes, for example, could be a very interesting thing to say, to refer or to look more into what type of actors or what type of commodity is being grown there. Yeah, so field size, for example, could be a very good thing to look at.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I like to link the pixels with the people in this case, but you said we just keep with the pixels. That's what I understood from you. So I was wondering, why not link it with participatory mapping, land use history things? Because then you get the processes. Of course, it's a bit more qualitative, but having more of them gets actually more quantitative. And then you get your time series with the qualitative stuff, and you can explain the social-ecological system better. That would be more a question. And then you set policy implication. So can you give us one example? What would be the potential policy implication of the map?
So,
thank you.
Okay. Two very good points. Yeah. The first point is I probably did a poor job in explaining this. So we're trying to take these maps and link this now in the next step to actors. So we have people doing interviews on the ground to actually establish this linkage that you described. Yeah. So when you look at these policy measures, you could, for example, say in a recently emerging frontier that is ongoing very rapidly, you may want to implement stopgap measures, because you still have a lot of natural vegetation left that is maybe worth more protecting. Whereas, for example, if you go in areas where the frontier is already suspended, you may look into monitoring land consolidation or monitoring intensification processes.
Okay, I think my question was also close to the first question. What about the spatial patterns? I think of frontiers as sort of ensemble of pixels. So what about considering also your neighboring dynamics to define your own one? And the second question is, do you have a sense of how many years do you need to have? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Talk about the second question after the session, yeah? The first question it's a very good point, yeah? And this is, I think, where we build at the moment the link with the forest fronts from the WWF. Because at the moment, we have pixels, and we group them based on a delineation that we made before. But actually, it could be very interesting to group similar pixels and then derive individual regions. But we haven't done this in this work, but we're doing it at the moment together, or we're aiming in doing it together with the more qualitative work from WWF.
All right. Thank you for your interesting questions and answers. And it began to Matthias. And I would like now to ask Johannes Jamaludin to the front. He is a doctoral researcher at the Department of Forest Sciences at the Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello everyone, Johannes here, and today I'll be presenting a pixel-based approach of quantifying land change trajectories from time series data. Land cover data is a key resource for a wide variety of environmental applications, but underpinning all applications is the requirement that interpretations of land cover and land change can be confidently drawn from the data. However, as we know, map errors are an inherent byproduct of the classification process. But the problem arises when errors in individual maps carry over into assessments of land change, and this particularly occurs when pairs of spatially coincident land cover maps are differenced on a per-pixel basis. This is a method known as post-classification comparison, or PCC for short. But despite this known limitation, PCC has remained the main approach of quantifying land change from land cover data. The main approach to account for map error in the quantification revolves around the use of sample-based map validation techniques. However, as many of you know, ground truthing is costly, and the availability of high-resolution imagery as reference data is spatially non-uniform across the globe and is rarely provided at the temporal cadence needed to validate complex changes in dynamic landscapes. As land cover data are increasingly produced at higher spatial temporal scales, this poses a twofold problem, wherein the issue of compounded error by PCC will become more severe in quantification and will also become harder to address using existing map validation techniques. Map error eventually stems from the individual pixel, and so there is a need for methods that can differentiate between pixels with map transitions that are reliable or logical versus those that are potentially erroneous. This is because only pixels reliably reflecting known processes of land change should be included in the quantification, whereas those with spuriously mapped transitions should be discarded or corrected where appropriate. A promising opportunity lies in the use of pixel history-based techniques, and the distinction from PCC begins by evaluating the entire pixel history mapped for each pixel over successive time points. However, from an initial scoping of the literature, what we found was that such methods lacked a systematic protocol and further have been seldom applied relative to PCC, with only 18 such studies observed over the past 2 decades. Furthermore, the data analyzed in pixel history-based studies rarely span more than 5 observation years, and with one map every 5 years. And what this means is that the potential for pixel history-based methods to leverage an increasingly dense spatiotemporal data landscape remains largely unexplored. To fill this gap, we present the Pixel Time Series, or PTS. It's an analytical framework with one sole purpose, which is to extract the most accurate signals of land change that is directly interpretable from time series data. The first step involves vectorization of pixels and consolidating the annual land cover over the entire time series, after which pixels are classified into 4 trajectory types depending on the sequence of land cover that has been observed. The first is persistence, and this is easy because the same land cover type has been mapped in each year of the time series. Single-step transitions, when there is only one transition observed over time. Multi-step, when there is more than one, and with at least 3 unique land cover classes. And last but not least, a category called switching, when transitions oscillate back and forth between only 2 land cover types. Now, when it comes to the quantification, persistence can be assumed to be reliable because the same land cover type was consistently mapped in each year of the time series. There is no reason to suspect for error in the quantification from this. Whereas for single-step trajectories, this can also be directly accepted, with the exception of illogical transitions that were mapped. For multi-step trajectories, in deforestation in the tropics, 2-step trajectories are the most commonly reported, and anything beyond 2 is indicative of more complex processes of land change, with one notable example being shifting agriculture for Sweden. Finally, switching can result from misclassification of 2 land cover types sharing similar spectral properties over time. However, it can also result from real changes that are more subtle, taking place as part of stable land systems. Regardless, both instances of switching do not represent premeditated processes of land conversion, and so they are better treated as land persistence, which is what we propose in the PTS. We apply the PTS to a case study of forest change in Southeast Asia, using 2 recently developed 30-meter annual land cover datasets, the first being the Sever Mekong dataset for mainland Southeast Asia, and the Met Biomass Nusantara dataset for Indonesia. In total, we applied the PTS to about 4.5 billion pixels across the entire region, and our goal of this study was to address 2 main objectives. The first is to quantify how differences between forest change estimates varied spatially and temporally when quantified using the traditional approach of PCC versus the PTS that we propose. And the second is to evaluate the potential of PTS in quantifying multi-step processes of land change. However, for this talk, I will be focusing only on the first. Estimates derived by PCC will always yield the highest maximum estimate of land change, because PCC accepts any and all map trajectories into the quantification. When we compare the cumulative annual estimates of gross forest change, what we observed was that in the case of Indonesia, there is a very large and continuous divergence between cumulative estimates of gross forest loss and gain that eventually led to sizable disparity in final estimates of total change. We observed something similar in mainland Southeast Asia, but as you can see, the disparity is less acute in terms of its magnitude, and it's only significant for losses and not much for gains. But the takeaway point from here is that the disparity that you see between the sets of curves is coming from uncertainty from switching and multi-step trajectories that PCC automatically accepts for quantification. So what are the sources of these differences between both estimates? When we went back and looked at the pixel histories to evaluate them further, we were able to determine the sources of differences, and as you can see in the case of Indonesia, the large proportion of bars in the yellow color represent the high contribution of switching within forest and non-forest categories over time. Whereas for mainland Southeast Asia, this is less important and is mostly from multi-step trajectories. However, the interesting thing is that because switching involves land cover transitions that oscillate back and forth, the eventual effect of switching on net changes is limited. Rather, multi-step trajectories contributed almost exclusively to the overinflation by PCC when it comes to net change. Overinflation by PCC does not stop at regional statistics of land change. It also influences spatial interpretations of where changes are happening. So when we aggregated the data into 5.6 kilometer grid squares across the region, what we found was that PCC led to interpretations of net forest losses that were more intense and more widespread as opposed to when calculated by the PTS. As you can see here in Sumatra, the number of grids belonging to the yellow category, which is the fourth and highest rate quantile for losses, is much more extensive when calculated by PTS. And similarly, we observed in Kalimantan that this is also true when calculated by the PTS. The intensity of net losses are much more muted and less acute. However, in mainland Southeast Asia, when we do this side-by-side comparison of both methods in spatial estimates of forest change, they are less dissimilar. But we investigated this further at the grid level and quantified the differences between both methods, and what we found was that there was an extremely high spatial heterogeneity in the differences when quantified by both methods. A quick note on the colors here, the grays represent low percent disagreement between both methods, below 15%. Blues represent medium disagreement, 15 to 50. And anything beyond 50% disagreement, which is quite large, is from the yellows to the reds. Here it's quite clear that the story for Indonesia is that the source of overinflation in net loss estimates is coming from the high percent different grids. But for mainland Southeast Asia, we can see that the highest source of overinflation is from the medium percent different grids that are distributed widely across the region. And so here we demonstrate how the PCC incurs overinflation that is spatially varying across the landscape. But PCC is not only used to quantify land change, it is also used as a very common step to process land cover data. And so the issues of uncertainty from PCC likely permeates across a wide variety of downstream applications, such as hotspot mapping, monitoring progress towards environmental goals, and simulating future land change. In conclusion, PCC has remained the de facto approach of quantifying land change from land cover data, and it has featured extensively even in our own previous work. However, the main message from this study is that PCC incurs considerable uncertainty in estimates of change. Map errors will always be an intrinsic feature of any land cover dataset. The responsibility of improving understanding of land change should not rest solely on improvements to classification. it should be combined with analytical methods that allow for interrogation of time series data. Last but not least, we therefore call for a shift away from the over-reliance on PCC, and we hope that the PTS can serve as a key starting point towards a more comprehensive, trajectory-based quantification of land change. Thank you.
Also, thank you from my side for sticking perfectly in time. So we have time for many questions. I will pass on the microphone so you can give yours.
Really cool talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering, to what extent do you feel like sometimes you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Because some of these switching changes are going to be real disturbances with secondary forests, or cutting down a patch of oil palm and then replanting it quickly in that landscape that you're highlighting. And some of them are going to be cloud-related disturbances. And it seems like there's both going on at the same time.
Thank you for the question. You are exactly correct. There was actually a recent paper by Gil Pontius and colleagues speaking about this behavior, where switching can be both erroneous or real. But the thing is that when they toggle over time, there is this unintended effect of gross changes happening that is overinflated. And what I didn't show from the slide was the spatial footprint of switching in both landscapes. We actually found that in both Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia, switching accounted for about a constant 9% of the landscape, and this is across all land cover categories. But to give you a gist of the scale, switching between forest and non-forest in Indonesia was about 90,000 square kilometers, but in total, it led to about 300,000 or so overinflated changes in gross loss and gains combined together. Numbers are a little bit off, but the scale of this is from the switching.
Okay, now I go to the back.
Thank you for your presentation, and it's really interesting. And I want to ask you a question. CCDC is very effective in the field of time series change detection. So I would like to ask you, where is the innovation of your work comparing with the CCDC?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, CCDC is one of the new methods that has been proven to be quite effective when it sorts out temporal spectral signatures over time. But I would like to clarify that this method is mostly GIS based. It doesn't involve the remote sensing component that CCDC can help to promote. So again, I'd like to stress that the PTS here is actually complementary to methods such as the CCDC. And the whole goal is to arrive at a more accurate understanding of land change that is temporally dynamic.
We have time for one more quick question. Wait a second.
Thank you again for the talk. It was really interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is like savanna landscapes that are highly heterogeneous and they change very rapidly by season. So do you think that the patterns you're seeing with the switching are indicative or ideal approach for specific ecosystems, or do you think that there's a blanket way that you can include this idea of switching into some of these highly dynamic systems?
Thank you again for the question. You're also right. In the case of mainland Southeast Asia, there's a lot of dry forests there that burn a lot and they degrade quickly, but they also recover fairly quickly. And so it's easy to conceive of that kind of behavior to be switching, right? So switching can indeed be a representation of real changes that are happening ecologically, but the purpose of the PTS here is to focus more on premeditated processes of land change. But that being said, the PTS is something that will allow those who are interested to look at those kinds of switching dynamics further, because every pixel is in the end geocoded for further investigation. So that answers.
Thank you for your answers. Thank you for your questions. And thanks for the presentation too. Okay, as a third speaker, I would like to invite Elias Nuzamzi to the front. Elias is a doctoral researcher at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation Science at the University of Queensland. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elias Nuzamzi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Queensland. I'm going to present a part of my PhD projects, which is aiming to upscale our mapping approach for artisanal small-scale mining, especially in tropical regions in Indonesia, to hopefully can support our government land use management practices, because we currently do not have many spatial data about the locations of small-scale mining. So in the last 2 decades, we are witnessing an increasing trend of resource demands that also triggers increasing rates of new mining activities, which is often overlooked because their footprints are often small. But in developing countries, there are lots of types of mining activities, not only large-scale mining activities from large corporations, but there are also artisanal small-scale mining activities that is conducted by underprivileged people who are turning into artisanal small-scale mining as their unique source of income. We currently do not have many definitive definitions about what ASM is, but there are these 4 characteristics of what artisanal small-scale mining. And then if we map them into their level of land use in the x-axis, on also the mechanizations level in the y-axis, there are several categories of what consists ASM is. And artisanal small-scale mining can be defined as a single persons who collect resources or gold by just using a very simple tools such as panning. Small-scale mining using a little bit more advanced and conducted by a group of people. Technified small-scale mining use a little bit more advanced tools, and extensive small-scale mining is when many small-scale mining are conjoining each other in a large area. So if we look further down into the numbers, millions of people depends on this activity, and about 150 million in the 80 countries depends on these activities, and especially in Africa, in Ghana and Sierra Leone, about 30% of their populations depends on this activity. And like in most countries, about 80% of them are informal. So the remote sensing tools that we usually use in the land management activity could not really helpful in this case, because there are a lot of challenges. For example, a large amount of data that we needed to map regional scale ASM, the small surface footprint of ASM that make it difficult for freely available imageries to map them compared to high resolutions. And also sometimes there is spectral signatures confusion, because their spectral signature is almost the same as any other disturbances. So we collected studies on remote sensing studies that are trying to map artisanal small-scale mining, and for now we only have like 52 studies, and most of them are mapping ASM, the type of ASM that is easily identifiable, such as open pit ASM. And also we are currently witnessing a trend of using synthetic aperture radar to map ASM, but then there is this untested method of combining multispectral and radar data to map ASM. So from that, we conducted a study to fuse multispectral and radar data to map ASM in a regional scale. Regional scale means larger than 100,000 kilometers square. And we used freely available satellite imagery in cloud processing platforms such as Google Earth engines to push the cost as low as possible. So we collected small-scale mining locations. This is what small-scale mining look like in the middle of Kalimantan forest. And we combine both multispectral and radar data and fuse them at the feature level. And this is what small-scale mining looks like on multispectral imagery. This is what ASMs looks like on radar data. So we used random forest for this analysis with 1,000 iterations, optimizations, and also hypertuning. And then if we achieve 85% accuracy, we will upscale the mapping into the whole Kalimantan area. From our preliminary result, we achieve 85% of overall accuracy, also a lower level of false positive. And if we balance the accuracy process with the ratio between ISM and non-ISM, we achieve 81% of accuracy. And if we compare our fusion method with the mapping process that is only used multispectral imageries, this is our part. This is part of training data. The green polygon is oil palm plantation. The red polygon is small-scale mining. If we only use multispectral data, there are lots of false positive because their spectral signature is almost the same. But if we use our fusion model, we can identify small-scale mining much more accurately. So basically, our fusion approach can produce high overall accuracy and lower false positive, also false negative error. So basically, our project is trying to undertake the challenge to map ASM at a much more regional scale. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. We have lots of time for questions because it took only 7 minutes to present. So we have really a lot of time for questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. From your reference data, you showed that it's what I would see. It's like a visual inspection of Google Earth images or something. Do you also go to the field and do true ground truthing? So you visit ASMs in the field to check, because of course sometimes in these river systems you have sedimentation, landslide processes, and this comes on top of, false positives.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. We collected ground data, but not me personally, because it's a little bit dangerous in the locations. Most of them are illegal artisanal small-scale mining, so there are lots of security reasons that prevents me to go there. So we basically hire local people to visit many artisanal small-scale mining points. So we collected around 1,000 small-scale mining locations on the ground.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. It's more a clarification that I need. So the decision that you take, is that still at the pixel level, or are you building objects? Sorry if you said it and I missed it.
Oh yeah, this decision is at the feature level. So for each multispectral and radar data, we made a covariance which consists of indexes. For radar, for example, ratio between vertical and horizontal vertical ratio, which is basically trying to differentiate the concave that is resulted from mining. So there is a different level of surface soil. And then we also develop we use spectral indices such as the mining waste index and also bare soil index. So all of the random forest decisions is based on this feature level.
Hi, yes, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, on the last slide, you indicated that this work can contribute to environmental management. I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit, especially given the security implications of what you're doing in terms of mapping out ASM, which is environmentally destructive, but it's also a critical livelihood resource for a lot of these communities. So how you're thinking about that and balancing that in your work.
Thank you for that. So Indonesia's government are currently basically trying to formalize many this artisanal small-scale mining. So they are currently trying to develop a specific area or zone that can be used for the people to mine. But we currently do not have many data or where they are now. So if we can kind of identify where they are now, and then we are not trying to hunt them down. We're basically just trying to look into specific area of where we can use as a specific zone for artisanal small-scale mining that is not destroying new lands or new area, but just use it as a specific area for small-scale mining. Thank you.
Thank you. When you think about maybe expanding this method to other parts of the earth, my question was, do you have a sense of what the benefit of the radar is, whether it's providing more observations through the cloud cover or linked to the inherent properties of the ASM land cover? Thanks.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. So one of the problem in mapping in tropical regions are cloud cover. The utilizations of radar data is basically because it can penetrate the cloud cover. And also we use radar data to detect the change in the surface level. So mining has some kind of a concave of soil. So radar data, we use a ratio of radar data to detect this concave of small-scale mining area. So we can differentiate between small-scale mining and also sedimentations in the river because it's that different of surface level.
Thanks. Really cool. Are you exploiting the phenology of the Sentinel-1 data? Since you have that dense time series, you've got open areas where it's getting all the way down to the ground. You're working in systems where they're using a lot of small-scale ponds. I'm thinking you could potentially take advantage of how Sentinel-1 changes over the year to sort of extract additional data and maybe differentiate those. I saw you had some very small commission error along the river. You might be able to pull that last bit out by kind of exploiting the rising and falling of the waters within those artisanal lines.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't really understand your question.
It's okay. I just talk very oddly. So the phenology, the change in Sentinel-1 over the course of the year, it doesn't always get exploited, even though you have a very dense time series. A lot of people do seasonal Sentinel-1 composites. There's a lot of information there that could potentially be pulled out, especially since Sentinel-1 is going all the way down to the ground. You're dealing with a system with lots of small ponds where the water level is going to rise and fall potentially. There might be some really neat information. Have you exploited that? Are you using a kind of a time composite of Sentinel-1? Or are you looking at mini dates?
Yeah, we use just the time composite for that, so we don't like mini dates. That will be good. Yeah, I'll try for the next part of our study.
Any additional questions? If not, then I would like to put the perfect the next presentation, and of course to give Elias a big hand. Thanks for the presentation and the good discussion. All right, as the fourth speaker, I already introduced Anna. Anna Buchadas from UC Leuven, formerly Humboldt University Berlin. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So I will piggyback a bit on Matthias' work because my work is very much a parallel work that we did at Humboldt, where we try to map differentiation processes, but in this case leveraging global data sets. So I wanted to bring your attention to this map, which is the report from Deforestation Fronts from the WWF. Is an extremely important report that looks at major hotspots of deforestation in red. Yet, when we think about deforestation in our work, we are a bit more concerned about trying to better represent these specific processes. So in our work, the deforestation frontier is a process of expansion of land use that leads to high or sustained loss of forests or woodlands. And as Matthias already spoke to, mapping deforestation is often been more an exercise of looking at cumulative exercises of how much has been lost, linking land cover change, when has it happened, and this is extremely important, of course. Okay, there are some differences here. Okay, but indeed is missing some spatial temporal processes that we could potentially better understand. And this will argue that the specific spatial temporal patterns are also potentially an indication of what are the drivers behind this deforestation. Or, as we can see above, for instance, a more large-scale agricultural deforestation led will be potentially more homogenized in space, will be faster, while if it's a small-scale agricultural-led deforestation, will be probably slower and more heterogeneous in space. And so understanding specific spatial temporal patterns can give us indication of this, can also give us indication on when to act. And on acting, conservation tries to address these questions of deforestation. And it's important to understand what are the potential actors that we are working with, to understand what type of approaches we could do. If a more area-based approach, working with protected areas enforcement or indigenous people's land rights, or if you want to work with commodity sector, or through a more sector-based approach. For conservation, it's also important to understand what are the priorities to conserve. So where is carbon areas that are important, where is areas of biodiversity relevance. Of course, this is a very simplified version of this. And so in this work, we try to bring this to the overlooked tropical dry woodlands. In this case, it's a very vast area that we include, that includes tropical and subtropical dry forests, woodlands, and savannas. But these are areas that are, of course, very important for the many endemic species that are there, that have adapted for dry systems, that have also they also have important carbon stocks that are important to limit or mitigate climate change, and where, contrary to some of the areas, a lot of people use these lands, are depending on them, and also linked with those in a more cultural way. And as you can imagine, these are also areas that are where major hotspots are occurring in deforestation. So I would try to check on their message. Okay, I'll try in this presentation to do maybe something a bit ambitious, which is to present you two works that have been published in the last 2 years from my thesis. The first one is where we try to characterize frontier types, and then we relate those with social-ecological characteristics that potentially explain what is happening there, or give us some indication. And the second one is try to use these frontier types as boundary objects to better inform conservation in a way. And for this, we link with biodiversity and carbon data, and also we overlay with forms of woodland protection that are already available for us. So for the first part of the work, we use a global forest change data set from the period of 2000 to 2020 at a 3 by 3 kilometer. We first tried to detect what were frontiers based on minimal woodland and a minimal amount of loss in a certain period. And for those pixels that were then selected as frontiers, we derived 6 metrics that were combined into 3 typologies. So severity typology that looked at how much woodland was there initially and how much of it was lost. Spatial temporal patterns that looked at the speed of the frontier, and also fragmentation that looked at the fragmentation process of the woodland loss, and the development stage, which looked at when was this frontier active, if it's old or new or emergent, and how much woodland was left, so how much could still progress this potential frontier. We further grouped those, considering all the metrics in major frontier types, which we then found 5 types, and this allows us to more easily compare across geographies. But of course, we lost also some thematic resolution as we do this. This last set of major archetypes were then combined with social-ecological characteristics to better understand them. So going to the results, for the area that we analyzed, around 71 million hectares were lost. The severity of the frontiers were very different, but we could see that high severity frontiers were in areas like the Gran Chaco, Cerrado in Southeast Asia. For the spatial temporal patterns, we could see that faster frontiers were also in areas like the Chaco and Southeast Asia. And for development stage, we could see that typically frontiers in South America were older, while many frontiers in Africa woodlands were emerging. As we go into the archetypes, I will focus on only two of them to simplify. Rampant frontiers were frontiers that were very fast and with high severity, and as you can imagine, those were in the areas of the Chaco again and Southeast Asia. And fragmented frontiers, which were frontiers that were more fragmented in space and active in this case, were in areas like the Maranhão and in the Miombo woodlands of Mozambique. As we then link those to the social-ecological variables that we analyzed, we could see that for rampant frontiers, they were associated with deforestation, commodity-driven deforestation, based on the comparison with Curtis data, with larger field sizes, with lower accessibility, and with slightly more moderate agri-resource ability, while fragmented frontiers were often associated with more smallholder-driven deforestation, with very small to small field sizes, with higher accessibility and more marginal agri-suitability. To the second part of the work, we try to combine deforestation frontiers in a simplified version with conservation assets as we look into the highest proportion of carbon and biodiversity variables, and further with protected areas and indigenous peoples' lands. So when we combine frontiers with forms of protection, we could see that frontiers were often in a sliding scale where protected areas coincided with indigenous peoples' lands had the lowest share of frontiers. We could see that near protected areas were quite similar to unprotected areas and with slightly more emergent frontiers. As we combine frontiers with conservation assets, we could see that generally frontiers were, sorry, these graphs are very difficult to read, so bear with me, but that generally frontiers were overrepresented in important areas for carbon and biodiversity species richness, but of course there were variabilities depending on the types of frontiers. As we further group the three dimensions for this specific 30% top areas of carbon and biodiversity species richness, we could see, I will focus on two of them, that near protected areas and within protected areas, frontiers were overrepresented in areas that were important for carbon. Interestingly, for near protected areas, they were also overrepresented with all types for biodiversity species richness. While for protected areas, we could see that, fortunately, rampant frontiers were underrepresented in these areas. And how this goes into conservation is, of course, a very much a global perspective. So this is more about pushing narratives and understanding how can we face this. But this is an example of when we think about emergent frontiers and areas that are near protected areas, we could consider that these are areas that are important to monitor and are also important to potentially bring new tools to further protect these areas, be it from payments for ecosystem service, further supporting land rights, or thinking of other OECM approaches. While if we go into rampant frontiers that are in protected areas, this is clearly something that we have to work in a sector based with supply change, but also the enforcement of the protected areas clearly not working. So this is just an example of how these frontier types can potentially inform conservation. And as we go along, we will have other suggestions. Perfect. So some takeaways. So in this work, we could see that major frontier patterns were associated with specific socio-ecological contexts. For example, what I showed you, rampant frontiers were more associated with commodity-driven deforestation, while fragmented with more smallholder-driven deforestation. We could see the importance of indigenous peoples' lands, particularly when they were coinciding with protected areas. We could see that important areas for carbon and biodiversity may be at risk, especially near protected areas. And more importantly, that combining frontier types with forms of protection can be a way to inform more targeted conservation approach. More generally, what I was trying to convey here is that frontier types can work as a boundary object that we can link with constellations of drivers, of outcomes, to better understand what is happening here, to gain a mechanism understanding, and further also potentially work with a more local scale analysis where we try to link more place-based research with these archetypes to potentially inform, support, or challenge the frontier types that we have defined here. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna, for the great presentation, and again for staying perfectly in time. We have time for several questions. Who wants to go first? Okay.
Hi, Anna. That was super interesting. I have a question regarding your last takeaway. Have you done any exercise in downscaling and, putting, to the test your archetypes or complementing them with more local data?
I think unfortunately my answer is no. It would be super interesting because, of course, this is an exercise that is global, that comes with their own limitations, and linking this with a more local scale analysis to potentially challenge or support would be super interesting. So if anyone wants to collaborate, we'll be good on this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. A simple clarification question would be, what constitutes near in the the buffer? So what constitutes near? And another one would be when you use the concept of boundary object. Are you talking from science and technology studies, kind of literature that thinks of boundary objects in a certain way that translate between different epistemic communities? Just curious on that kind of point. Thank you.
Yeah. So for the first question, in this case, we then switched to a higher resolution, so 10 to 10 kilometer. And the buffer was 10 kilometers from the predator. For the second question, that's a very good question. In a sense, yes, but I'm not sure how many epistemologies will be interested in my frontier types, so it may stay within our room. But yeah, the idea is to that this allows to be a point of connection with other works, and yeah, that was the point here. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much. I would like to know, is it like this? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to know is how the pixel size would affect your analysis, the pixel size. Mm-hmm. And also, I saw you, there are 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers. Is that your analysis unit?
Yeah.
Sorry. What I'm thinking is for tropical dry forest, because it's normally very fragmented. So big pixel size would probably leave some forest area out. And I don't know if that can be considered in your analysis. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So for the first was the 3x3. We had initially the set of 30 by 30, as you may be aware. So we just scaled that. And then as we translated to the second work, because we were working with other data sets, we put it up. I think in general the archetypes were similar, but I understand what is your question, and I think this is something that we may need to further test at different scales to better understand or do some kind of sensitive analysis to further improve this. I hope I answered you more or less. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for your presentation and answers. Yeah. And as the fifth speaker, I would like to invite Olivia Del Giorgio to the front. Olivia is a doctoral researcher at the Institute for the Study of International Development and the Department of Geography at McGill University, Canada. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, first and foremost. Can you hear me okay? Microphone fine? Okay. Closer. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. I've had comments before, my voice is slow, so. Today I'm going to be I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And today I'm going to be presenting some work that's coming from a paper we've been working on with Matthias Baumann, Tobias Kummerle, and Jan Lupana, who are all present here. And to give you a bit of a direction of where my talk is going to be going, the title is beyond the deforestation front, revealing land control dynamics in emerging agricultural frontiers. Maybe, maybe not. It's this one, right? Oh, okay. So I'm going to actually skip this bit because Matthias and Anna and the previous speakers have done an excellent job of introducing deforestation frontiers. So I can just move right back into the Chaco, which a couple of us have also already presented on. Let's see if this works. Anna also beat me to having a time series. But so back into the Chaco, this is a 1 million square kilometer ecoregion that spans between Argentina, Bolivia, and Paraguay. A subtropical dry forest ecoregion that here what we're seeing is this process of large-scale commodity agriculture expanding over the region, mainly soybean production that's coupled with maize, alternated with maize, and cattle ranching. And then here on this right figure by Maria Vallejo and colleagues from 2015, we have a great depiction of how this process is expanding over the region. So beginning from the peripheries of the area in these yellow colors, beginning in the 1970s, 80s, and then moving into the more central parts of the region through the 2000s. And overall, generally, these commodity frontiers from at least a large-scale perspective have been understood in this way by mapping crop-level deforestation for agriculture. But what we're missing from this is sort of an earlier perspective on the processes happening that lead to this later stage frontier development. So just to try to illustrate this, we can think of each of these panels as a time point in the development of these frontiers. If we focus on the later panels or the later time points, this agribusiness decided to consolidate and convert this plot to agriculture. But at some point beforehand, in the earlier stages of this frontier development, that agribusiness necessarily had to consolidate control over that plot of land. So the foundations of this line of thinking are essentially that where there are previous occupants and users of a given territory, there must be a change in the norms or the dynamics of land control that set the stage for eventual deforestation. In the case of the Chaco here, I'd like to highlight that that's a process that's happening where agribusiness grab control over land from indigenous and criollo smallholders. So the objective that we had for this paper or this work is to develop an approach to map the land control changes associated to the early stages of frontier development. And to do that, first, we had to find an indicator, a meaningful indicator of these processes for the Chaco specifically. And this is where the lindes and Buchadas pop into the picture that I've been sort of obsessed with for quite a few years now. These are very linear forest demarcations that are cleared in the region by a mix of actors, but principally by agribusiness, to claim rights to the exclusive use of land because they hold legal weight. So they're used as claims to property usually, or in the titling process. So what we did is leverage the appearance of these forest demarcations as a way to understand the land claiming dynamics in the region. So what I'll do is I'll go into sort of the broad 4 stages quickly that we've developed for this approach, and then jump into some of the results that we're getting from it. So to start off, what we did, just feature detection involved trying to extract linear features from Sentinel-2 imagery. The challenge here was that unlike roads that are relatively consistent in their spectral signature, these forest demarcations vary quite a bit in their brush cover depending on where and when they've been cleared. So that creates a very varied spectral signature. And also in their width, depending on who's cleared them, if it's been smallholder in response to encroachment or if it's agribusiness with large-scale machinery. So the patch that we found to this that worked quite well was using a combination of linear, of image texture analysis to extract these linear features based on their consistent shape, paired with some weakly supervised machine learning, random forests, to group disjointed linear segments into meaningful continuous structures. So with that, what we got is this data set of linear features for the 1 million square kilometers of Iran Chaco. And the next this is some examples of the linear features in magenta. And the next step involved, so we needed to polish off that data set to isolate the forest demarcation specifically from the rest of everything that's linear. So this involved a basic cleaning and then masking features that fell within or along the borders of agricultural fields, water bodies, roads, and I haven't added here the urban areas as well. With that then, well, here what we have then is a data set of forest demarcations for the Gran Chaco, and what we wanted, which added to roughly over 290,000 kilometers of forest demarcations. And what we wanted to add to that next is not just a time snapshot time point vision of this for 2020, but also some temporal information to understand the dynamics that lead up to some of what's happening here. So we moved the analysis over to Google Earth Engine and used the wonderful land trender algorithm. It's a temporal segmentation algorithm to give each of these linear segments a year of appearance. And lastly, conducted a spatial analysis with this data set. So now we have a data set of forest demarcations for the Chaco that's roughly temporally complete, let's say, and we produced some metrics that I'll get into now as the results. So firstly, we mapped the density of forest demarcations across the Chaco. We can think of this density metric as sort of an indicator of claiming intensity in some ways. So it's the total length of demarcations that fall within 10 by 10 aggregation pixels that we use for this metric, corrected by the amount of forest within each of those grid cells. To just highlight some of the numbers that we're getting from this, so of the remaining forested area in the Chaco in 2020, so that represented 66% of the Chaco, 30% had medium to very high levels of land claiming, so in the yellow to dark red gradient here. And on the counterpart to that, about 37% of the Chaco had very low levels of land claiming in that intermediary blue. Something interesting to highlight quickly is how those levels, the density overlap with protected areas. This is just exploratory, so a lot more to be done on this by anyone who's interested. But the protected areas are delimited in green, and what we found was that in 2020, these areas took up 15% of the total Chaco, but they held a big chunk of these low density claiming areas, so about 25%. Outside of those protected areas that had low or no claiming density really correspond quite well with low agricultural suitability, so areas that are steeper or drier than the rest. Then we developed 3 metrics based on the date of appearance of these demarcations, so the dynamics, the claiming speed, that's based on the standard deviation of the date of appearance within each of these aggregate grid cells, the peak period, which is the majority date of appearance within each of these grid cells, and the last activity, which is sort of an indicator of the recency of claiming activity in different areas, classified as whether or not there had been claiming since 2016 in each of these 10 by 10 cells. And then to start to try to narrow down this picture and clarify the narrative, what we did is overlap the specific combinations of these metrics to try to highlight hotspots of claiming activity. And I'll just try to highlight 3 takeaways from the claiming patterns map on the right. The first is that we found areas that had sort of a suspended state of land claiming. It's quite interesting. These are areas in the blue pixels that we've called having claiming maintenance. So there are areas where there were a high density, so there were no new claims since 2016, but there was a high density of older claims that had been maintained up until 2020. So this could point at potentially a waiting game being played by speculators and investors in those areas. Oh, sorry. I actually wanted to touch on the other 2. So then we have these consolidation fronts, areas of claiming consolidation, where we had recent claiming being added to already high density of land claims. Those are areas potentially where we might see imminent deforestation. And then this claiming emergence pattern where it was low density areas, but that we're seeing the rapid emergence of new claims since 2016, pointing to potentially a relatively recent and growing interest in land, mostly in Paraguay and Bolivia. Then what we did is we, again very exploratory, but used the activeness metric developed by Matthias and colleagues that was just presented to try to look at the overlap between deforestation, well, the activeness of these deforestation fronts and land claiming. So what we have in this bivariate choropleth, on the pink gradient is the land claiming density, and on the blue gradient we have the deforestation activeness metric. And so what stands out here are that the highest density of land claims, so they're concentrated around these active deforestation fronts where we see these dark purple colors. But something that I also want to point out is that we have land claiming that extends, high levels of land claiming that extend pretty far beyond these active deforestation fronts into forested areas, so that the dark pink color is the magenta. And those are areas that would otherwise have been discounted from being involved or implicated in these commodity frontiers had we not integrated something that captures these earlier dynamics. And lastly, also very exploratory, so a lot to be done on this, but we used the data set produced by Christian Levers and colleagues to look at the overlap between claiming density and the proportion of disappearance of smallholder homesteads since 2020 in the region. So again, this bivariate choropleth, and in the dark regions we have where those two overlap, so high claiming density and high disappearance of homesteads. And again, something to point out is maybe particularly interesting are these areas where are pretty far from these deforestation fronts where we have that overlap. And that does point to the fact that the pressures to access that are associated to these frontiers start to be felt quite before the consolidation and activation of deforestation for agriculture. So just to round up with this, by putting claiming dynamics on the map, we start to get a more complete picture of these frontiers overall. So maybe a truer footprint of the impacts and the extent of these frontiers that capture the land control dynamics that set the stage eventually for deforestation. Thank you. And I'm very happy to answer questions in Spanish as well.
Thank you for your presentation, and yeah, the floor is open for questions. I don't know who was first. I will start here and then go over to you, Patrick.
Hi, so this is super cool work. I really love it. I was just wondering if you could comment, right, who is this data for? Is this for communities to understand what's happening? Is this for policymakers? Is this for NGOs? Right? Who do you see using this, and how, essentially?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Ideally, what would come of this is that it can be streamlined, improved and streamlined to be something that's actualized year by year. So it could serve as some sort of, the GLAD alerts, some kind of alert system. In terms of the use for smallholders, the trickiness there is that it would almost be useful to disaggregate this into two separate data sets. One that's broad level, such as this, and another where we can actually dissociate the agribusiness from the smallholders, which we believe is possible based on the width of these demarcations, but we haven't done within the frame of this paper. So it could be something where we're able to sort of better dissociate what actors are claiming and where, and that could be, and also that would require a higher resolution, and that would be more useful in terms of land planning for smallholders, because at this resolution, it's a bit coarse. So not so true on the ground for communities, but useful on the broader scale. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks. I may have missed it, but you mask the cleared area, the agricultural areas, and so you do your analysis on the demarcation lines that are in the forest that we made. But with your time series, would you be able, in principle, to get a sense of how long time passes before the demarcation line appear and the plot is eventually possibly clear? That would give an indication about the kind of mechanism and things.
Yeah, it's a great question, and unfortunately not really with this data set, because the problem is that the demarcations were mapped for 2020, and so we can kind of understand the dynamics of appearance of those demarcations, but not the ones that were present in those fields beforehand. So what would be It's very coarse. It's very difficult. Yeah, so it does pick some up, but not as well as the Sentinel. So it's a compromise between the resolution and but going forward, if this was something to be mapped consistently each year, then we could start to look at that. Yeah.
We have time for one quick question.
Very cool. Awesome paper. Congratulations. Given the little bit that I know of your broader dissertation work, have you had the opportunity to talk with local folks, smallholders, and or other producers in your field research on some of these dynamics? I'm just curious to hear what some of their responses or thoughts might be, if that at all comes into some of the field research you've been doing too.
Yeah. So the work for this, or the fascination with the Indigenous and the Buchadas, came from talking with people about the processes happening in these regions. And I forgot to add, but for those that don't know, the Chaco, this represents a very abrupt and sort of marked change in the norms of access that traditionally were mixed communal open access regimes of livestock herding. So it really represents a very stark change in access to resources and claiming to resources. And the ways that people discuss or talk about how the landscape has been implicated by this is really interesting. The appearance suddenly of demarcation starting in the 70s, and then the addition to those of fencing. So some of these are accompanied by fences. That also is extremely recent. And also the response dynamics by smallholders that also changes within their own communities the norms of land access and management, which is fascinating. So I think there's a ton to do on this. I'm really happy to talk if anyone's interested in collaborating. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Oli. To thank all the presenters. And also you for attending. And please come back after the coffee break. We have 4 more fantastic presentations lined up. And yeah, enjoy the coffee break and see you in a bit. Bye-bye.